Hey everybody. Today we're going to wrap up our talk about rhythm, and there's I think three things that I wanted to cover today. Wanted to get into some of the odd or time signatures like 7/8 or 15/16, for example, just some of the stranger ones that you don't see that often. And kind of briefly, I wanted to cover a couple other kind of miscellaneous things like triplets and duplets, just sort of briefly explain how those work. And then also a little bit about reading music, especially like when you're playing piano or an instrument that reads, kind of a lot of music at once. You might get several different rhythms that sort of happen simultaneously. So I wanted to look at that just briefly too. But before we start, I wanted to say a really quick thank you, actually a huge thank you, to the people who've been donating to me over the past couple months. I kind of just very hesitantly stuck a little donate button on my channel page, thinking, just whatever, I'll throw it out there. And I've gotten some really fantastic, really generous donations. So just a humongous thanks to the people who have done that. I'm just a part-time music teacher, freelancer, so it just means a whole lot to me. And even beyond that, just a huge thank you to people who are still watching. I know we're pretty deep into the theory at this point and no longer at the surface level stuff. So if you're still here, that means you've invested some time, sitting around listening to me talk. So it really means a lot to me, just as a person, that you'd be doing that. But anyway, we'll get down to business here. Let's start by looking at 7/8, this sort of unusual time signature. So I'm sure you remember how to read these. All this means, 7/8, is that there are 7/8 notes in a measure. So here they are. And the interesting part is how these notes actually break up into beats. Obviously, it's not just 7 beats in this measure. They're going to be broken into groups. And there's actually a couple different ways that this can happen. There's not necessarily just one way to do this. So probably the simplest way is by breaking this into a group of 3. Make a little kind of sub measure here. A group of 3 and a group of 4. Probably the most common way this happens. And you can kind of compare that to 6/8, which is pretty similar. You remember 6/8, we had a group of 3 and then another group of 3. Basically, we had 2 beats, and each beat had 3/8 notes in it. In 7/8, if we break it up this way, we get a beat that has 3/8 notes in it, and then we get a beat that has 4. And really, it doesn't matter how you break it up, you're gonna wind up with unequal beats, and that's what's so unusual about a time signature like this. So basically, we have our first beat with 3/8 notes, and then our second beat with 4/8 notes. And that will mean that this second beat is longer. It will take more time to get through this beat than it will for this one. Now, if you were going to count this out, probably the simplest way is to just count it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But remember, the whole idea of these beats is that the very beginning of the beat gets accented. So this note sort of has a heavier feel to it, and this note has a heavier feel to it. So you would count it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It has a very unusual feel to it, and I'll actually play a little bit to kind of illustrate that. So here's similar to what I played on the last video, I think. I can't remember exactly, but here's what this would sound like in 6/8. Here's what this might sound like if we were in 7/8. I'm basically just adding an extra beat. You get the idea. It has an odd feel, but it can actually be very interesting. But that's one way to break up 7/8. Another way would be to do something more along these lines, where you have a beat with 3 parts, and then 2 beats with 2 little parts, 2 beats with 2 parts to them. So you'd be accenting 1, 4, and 6. This would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And let me play a quick example of that. I actually like this rhythm a lot. This can be kind of cool. So here's what this would sound like. You get the idea on that one too. There's a couple other possibilities here that you could break this up. You could do, a single beat here, and then 3. You could kind of shuffle this up any way you'd want to. But the obvious question is that if you see this on a piece of music, like 7/8, how do you know how it's supposed to be interpreted? And the answer is that you can't really tell just from the time signature. You'd have to look at the actual music. And almost always the music will kind of use the beaming of the notes to sort of show you how it ought to be interpreted, or they'll even put little accent marks over the tops of the notes. But that's the idea with 7/8, and actually all the odd time signatures are going to have the same kind of method to them, where you look at them and you kind of spell out all the notes in the measure and then try to understand how they're going to be grouped. And there's different ways that they could be. It really just depends on the music itself. So let's look at one more real quick, and that's that 15/16. And like I said at the outset, this looks kind of crazy. I mean, 15/16 notes. How do you deal with that? Same as before, there's different ways that this could be interpreted. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's a lot, but here's one way that I've seen this done. We basically have 4/16 notes making up the first beat, 3/16 notes making up the second, and then 4, and then 4. Now if you look at it this way, this actually isn't all that weird. If you think about 4/4, 4/4 has 4 quarter notes. But if we started to break those quarter notes down into faster notes, you would wind up with 4/16 notes for every beat. And the only real difference between 4/4 and 15/16, I'm not going to write out the rest of this, but the only real difference here is that on beat 2, you're kind of cutting off a little bit of it, cutting off that last 16th note. So there's actually a song that I like a lot. It's called Etude Number 2 by Philip Glass. If you've seen some of my other videos, I'm a big Philip Glass fan. But he has this exact rhythm, this 15/16 in the song. And I'll play it for you real quick. It's actually just using a C major 7th chord, or one of the chords he uses, and uses this rhythm. So here's what that sounds like. And that's part of it at least. But you can hear that the kind of one of the interesting things about that progression is that second beat. You get that little bit of a shorter rhythm there. And if he hadn't done this 15/16 rhythm, just stuck with something more straightforward like 4/4, it probably wouldn't have sounded quite as interesting. Part of what makes the song is that odd little sound right there. So anyway, I think that's it for the time signatures. If you've made it this far and you've grasped everything up to this point, you should be pretty comfortable with almost anything you run across. Obviously, there's a lot more possibilities here, but they all kind of follow the same logic. And if you get stuck, Wikipedia actually has a pretty good article on this stuff. It's not amazing, but there's a lot of good information. It's a good reference, so you can kind of use that to sort through anything you need to. One of the other things I wanted to go over today, just briefly, is triplets, and also duplets, kind of the almost anti-triplet. If you take a time signature like 4/4, really common one, most of the time you would see, let's just say we had eighth notes for the whole measure. And this is pretty straightforward. Remember, you would most likely just count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. If you remember, this is common time. It means that each beat just breaks up into 2 parts. So it'd be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. If we had a triplet, what you do with a triplet is a triplet would basically replace one of these guys. So for beat 3, we would have 3 eighth notes, and there would be this little triplet marking. Sometimes there's a little kind of arch going across or whatever. And this basically means that you're going to kind of, for just for one beat, just for this one little beat here, you're going to switch into compound time. And by compound time, that means that you have 3 parts to this beat. Now the important thing here is that this beat doesn't get any longer. It's still going to take just as long to get through this beat as it does for like beat 4 or any of the other ones. But you're kind of squeezing these notes in a little bit so you can get 3 of them in there. So these eighth notes are actually going faster than these eighth notes. So what they usually teach you in like elementary school band or something is to actually just count this out as triplet. It's a little goofy, but it sticks in your head and makes it pretty easy to remember. So if you're counting through this, you would count it or play it as 1 and 2 and triplet 4 and. One more time. 1 and 2 and triplet 4 and. It's a little tricky at first to kind of get the feel of this. The best thing you can really do is to just pick up a metronome, turn it on fairly slow, and just use that click to make sure that you're getting the beginning of the beats right where they should be. And if you speed up or slow down on this third beat, it'll be obvious, and you can kind of adjust for that. So really you're just developing this innate sense of what a triplet feels like. So the other almost kind of opposite of that would be a duplet. So if you take like 6/8 again, for example, normally you have 2 beats, each with 3/8 notes in them. And if you had a duplet, let's say we had another measure over here with a duplet in it. Say our first beat has these 3 parts to it. Second beat just has 2, and it would have a little 2 marked over it. And what that essentially does is it causes this beat to only have 2/8 notes, and these work just like it would in common time, where the beat is just broken up into 2 pieces instead of 3. So you would count this something like, not sure exactly what you say here, probably just 4 and, so maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, and something like that. Counting gets a little hazy when you're doing this kind of thing, you're really playing with the rhythm. But you count it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, and something along those lines. But these should essentially feel slower than these because it's taking only 2 notes to take up that whole beat instead of 3. Okay, so that's enough of that. And the last thing I wanted to do today was, what did I say? Oh, reading multiple rhythms at the same time. Now, this doesn't really happen if you're playing an instrument like, say, a saxophone or a trumpet or something, because you can only play one thing at once. But if you're playing something like a piano, you have to figure that you've got a lot of fingers available, and you might be doing kind of one rhythm in one hand and another in the other hand, or maybe even kind of 2 separate rhythms all happening in one hand together. So imagine something like this. Let's say we have a measure of 3/4. We have, let's say, dotted half note, a rest over top of it, and then a half note up here. Now, at first glance, this looks a little bit odd because, for one, you have a note and a rest happening at the same time. So, how is that possible? And then this note should last for 3 beats if we're in 3/4. So that should fill up the entire measure. But there's also this note there. So if you added their lengths together, it seems like there's 5 beats here, plus this rest, and that just doesn't make much sense. But what's essentially happening here is you have one, they call it a voice, but basically one kind of channel of music on the bottom, and then another one happening right above it. So this bottom part, this note, would last for all 3. You'd count it out as 1, 2, 3. Up top, the, say, upper voice of the music is resting for the first beat, and then playing this note for the next 2 beats. So you essentially have these 2 things happening in parallel. And to count it out, you would just keep counting this 1, 2, 3. This note would happen on 1, this note would happen on 2. It's pretty straightforward, but just realize that that's what's happening here, and when you start to get a lot of notes happening at once, this can start to get kind of confusing and not very obvious. So be aware that this kind of thing can happen. Anyway, I think that's it for today. We're going to just kind of wrap this up, or get wrapped up with the rhythm stuff. I think next up I'm going to go ahead and get back to the how to write music series and use some of this stuff like in context in actual music, and hopefully it'll be a little more clear then. So thanks very much. Thanks for watching as always, and I will see you soon.